Hello, welcome to episode 11 of My Mother's Diaries. July 1949, the height of summer. I'm Andy Vining, and each episode I open the pages of my mother's diaries written day by day on our family farm in Hampshire in 1949 through to 1976. Through her words, we step back into a world of farming, family, village life, and the small everyday moments that quietly make up a life. This is July 1949. By the time July arrived, summer had truly taken hold of the countryside. The days were long, the sun was strong, and the farm was working at full stretch. Pea picking had begun in earnest across the front field, and John and the men spent long hours gathering the crop, while the warm air hummed with the sound of insects and distant tractors. Life around the farmhouse was as busy as ever. I went up to the school for dancing lessons one morning, and I called in to see Joan afterwards. Later that day, we wandered over Tommy's for cricket practice, although why we wanted to practice cricket, I haven't got a clue. Before long, Tom, Lorna, Joan and Les all appeared at the house for a cup of tea, and what was meant to be a short visit turned into one of those cheerful evenings filled with laughter. The weather remained hot and dry. One morning John and I went shopping in Eastleigh, though everyone was already talking about the need for rain. The ground was beginning to dry badly, and even so the peas were doing well, and we sold several bushels to buyers in the village and at the shops on the parade. Back at the house, the kitchen filled with the scent of raspberries, as I bottled them for later in the year. Visitors came and went constantly. Nora and her family arrived. Later, Mother and Bella came and stayed for supper. Amid all the work, there were moments of pleasure too. One perfect summer day, we drove to the seaside at Highcliffe with the Beatons, the Parkers, and the children. The weather was glorious and the sea air fresh and bright. The children had a wonderful time running along the beach and paddling in the water, while the adults relaxed in the sunshine. It was a sort of simple summer day that stays in the memory for years, but back at the farm, the work quickly resumed. Washing and ironing filled one hot morning before I hurried off to the hairdresser's later in the afternoon. Even as evening approached, the air remained warm and heavy, though a few drops of rain teased us without delivering the proper shower everyone needed and hoped for. School activities continued as usual, and I spent time helping with dancing lessons. And one evening there was a cricket match between the old boys and the boys' club. The old boys won comfortably to the delight of all the older spectators. Joan and Les called in after the cricket, and we spent some time chatting, and then I showed Joan how to draw a chicken again, her second lesson, something she seemed determined to master. The next few days were busy with preparations for a local show. Peas were picked well into the evening, while I tried to organise everything needed for the following day. Then came one of the most memorable outings of the summer. Early one morning we set off with Joan and Les for the great agricultural show at Shrewsbury. The journey itself was wonderful, taking us through the rolling countryside of the Cotswolds and up into Shropshire. The show was magnificent. Animals, machinery, crowds of people, and everything that makes a country show so lively. That evening we stayed overnight at a comfortable hotel in Oswestry, and the following day we visited the show again before beginning the journey home in the afternoon. We stopped for tea in Worcester before finally arriving back at the farm that evening, tired but very happy after such a splendid trip. Life quickly returned to its usual rhythm. Mr. Cross came by one morning, and later the West family and Nora visited during the afternoon. Another quiet Sunday followed when relatives arrived in numbers and filled the house with conversation and chatter. The hot weather continued. John played tennis whenever he could find the time, though much of his attention was still on the peas and on the haymaking. School events continued too, parents' days, dancing practices and small gatherings that kept everyone moving back and forth between village and farm. Mother and Bella often came for tea, and Mr. Cross appeared regularly at the door to help out. The work of the house was constant as always. Needlework filled many quiet moments as I tried to keep ahead of the endless sewing and mending that I had to do. Eventually, the large pile of darning was finally finished, at least for a while. The weather remained stubbornly dry. One afternoon, after a long stretch of sunshine, rain finally arrived at last, but luckily we'd got all the hay safely into the barn. It was enough to stop the tennis matches for the evening, but everyone agreed it was really badly needed. Tommy arrived with a new tennis racket for me, which was rather a pleasant surprise, and I must say I did need one. The same evening, Mother came to stay at the farm because Bella began her holiday in London, at Enfield, with her daughter and son. Life carried on with its mixture of farm work and small pleasures. John bought a new swimming costume in the village one day, and there were trips to Eastleigh for shopping. There were tennis matches and small tournaments at Chalks on Kingsway. Some games were won and others lost, but the enjoyment was always the same. One particularly pleasant afternoon we went with Joan and Lester Standish to watch sheepdog trials. The dogs worked beautifully across the fields, guiding the sheep with quiet precision. And later that evening we had supper at the Parkers before driving home through the warm summer night. The days rolled on steadily. John checked the crops at Flexford, where the corn was beginning to look almost ready for harvest. At home, I continued with my sewing, working on Janet's frock while visitors dropped in for tea. Fruit preserving began in earnest as well. One day I bottled 15 jars of cherries, filling the kitchen with their deep red colour. Meanwhile, John started cutting the winter oats at Flexford, and a small hunting party returned in the evening with 12 rabbits taken from the fields and shot for the pot. Evenings often ended with gatherings of neighbours, dances in Winchester, or quiet conversations along the lane. And later in the month we received good news. The girls had been accepted into the convent school at last, a great relief after all the interviews and worries we'd had. The heat continued to build as July moved on. Fields of barley and oats were cut, and the work of gathering and carting filled long days under the sun. Sometimes the heat grew almost too strong. At Flexford, some oats were even burnt by the relentless sunshine. It was such a hot summer. Even so, the life of the farm went on. Visitors arriving regularly, Bet and Fred came for a week's holiday and spent time riding Smoky, our pony. There were cups of tea in the garden, evenings of conversation, and children moving happily between different houses. One afternoon I went to the hairdresser's and treated myself to a permanent wave before stopping by Joan's house for tea and ice on the way home. As July neared its end, the work of harvesting continued. Wheat was carted, barley gathered, and the fields slowly cleared. Mr. Cross came one morning and took a puppy away, which left the yard feeling strangely quiet. And one evening there was a lively tennis party at Chalks, full of laughter and good company. Bet and Fred eventually returned home, and Mother came to stay with us again. Visitors continued to pass by, including Jack and Molly Enright, calling in on their way home from Swanage. And then at last, the heat wave finally broke. On the final day of July, rain fell steadily, through the morning and again later in the evening. It was a welcome relief after the long, hot weeks. Inside the house I spent the day sewing and finally finished my pink frock. And so July came quietly to its close. A month of blazing sunshine, busy harvest fields, seaside days and summer shows, before the long-awaited rain returned at last to the Hampshire countryside. And so we move on to August 1949. And it began as many months did on the farm, with washing lines full, irons heating on the stove, and the rhythm steady of work round the house. While I was busy with washing and ironing one morning, Jennifer and Julie Dean were off to the Romsey Gymkhana with their ponies. Mr. and Mrs. Dean kindly took Andrew and Janet along as well. The evening ended peacefully at the Beaton's house, as so many evenings seemed to that summer. News soon arrived that Betty and Fred had now given notice at their house and would be returning home that week. Word travelled quickly through the family and preparations quietly began to receive them. Meanwhile, John and Norman dashed off to the Aberystwyth show, leaving in a rush as farm shows often required. But life around the farmhouse carried on as usual. I rose early one morning to see to the poultry, before settling down to cut out a new frock. Later, I cycled round to Beechcroft to see Mother. Trips into nearby towns were frequent that month, and one day John and I drove into Winchester, where I bought material for a new petticoat. The rest of the afternoon was spent quietly sewing, while Andrew entertained a friend for tea. By evening, the sewing basket had returned to my lap again. Needlework never ever seems far away. Family news continued to arrive. Eileen Hill called in one afternoon, and I walked up to the village before taking Mother back home again. The same day we sold one of the pigs, though it would remain with us for a while yet before being used for our lunch. John, meanwhile, was busy cutting spring oats in the fields. Saturday brought the usual stream of visitors. Doug and Marjorie called in for their eggs during the day, while news arrived that Nora had gone into a nursing home to have several teeth removed, poor lady. Stanley later telephoned us she had had 7 teeth taken out and was not feeling particularly well. Even so, life carried on, of course. Tennis matches were played, neighbours visited, and Julie Dean stayed the night with us. On Sunday the house filled again when Mother, Bet and Fred came for the day. The weather, however, had turned miserable now. Wind and rain sweeping across the fields, making the countryside feel more like autumn than high summer. Fortunately, the following day it improved. Joan and Lorna came up to the house and we took a walk round the fields together, enjoying the fresh air after the storm. The farm itself continued to produce its small miracles. One morning, after John had spent hours gathering oats at Flexford, we welcomed the arrival of our first heifer calf from a Jersey bull. It was an exciting moment for the farm, a fine, healthy calf to start our wonderful pedigreed Jersey herd. Soon afterwards, the harvest finally came to an end. After weeks of work across the fields, the last of the crops had been gathered in. Fred came to lend a hand, and Mr. Cross appeared in the evening to help us. There was a sense of relief across the farm as the work was finally completed. Visitors kept arriving in steady numbers. Auntie Sophie came by one day, and soon afterwards Joan and Les arrived with the children for tea. John spent hours thrashing the oats, while I stayed up late finishing another frock. By the end of the day, the thrashing too was complete. Preparations were quietly underway for something rather more exciting. A holiday. After months of work, it was finally time to escape for a while. One afternoon, we set off to Bracklesham Bay holiday camp down near Chichester, by the sea. The place was lively, perhaps a little noisy, but the beach was superb and the sea air refreshing after weeks of farm work. The days quickly settled into the rhythm of seaside life. Morning and afternoon were spent on the beach, while the evenings were filled with dancing, horse racing games, entertainment in the camp hall. One particularly hot day, the camp held a ceremony to choose its king and queen, a great spectacle for everyone staying there. I managed to catch a little too much sun myself and spent one evening feeling quite miserable before retreating early to bed, and I wrote a letter home to John. The children, however, seemed tireless. There were games on the beach, sandcastle competitions, and trips to the cinema tent. One evening there was a wonderful dance where the women dressed as men and the men all dressed as women. It was great fun for everyone. And a few days later I developed a dreadful cold and had to skip bathing in the sea for a day, settling instead for a quiet walk along the shore while the children watched a Punch and Judy show. The camp concert that evening provided entertainment for everyone, and life at the holiday camp continued with endless activity. Fancy dress competitions were held for the children, and Andrew appeared dressed as a choir boy and won first prize, which delighted him enormously. There were tennis games, sports races, and endless trips for the beach to swimming and paddling. At one point, John wrote to say he would be coming to visit, and during that day, Andrew was busy helping some men paint a fence and unhappily got stung by a bee, but he soon got over it. He didn't worry too much. John finally arrived with the Deans and Norman's family, and it felt like a small reunion on the beach. They played cricket on the sand and gathered together in the bar afterwards for drinks. Soon afterwards they had to leave again, though none of us were quite ready to say goodbye. The final days of the holiday passed quickly. There were more dances in the evening, more games on the beach, and the occasional rain shower that sent everyone running for shelter. Eventually the day came to return home. After the excitement of the holiday, the farm felt strangely quiet again. Bet had looked after everything wonderfully while we were away, and even made several batches of jam. The following days were gentle ones. There was washing to catch up on, and the usual housework waiting patiently. Mr. Cross arrived one morning carrying 24 pounds of plums, which meant another round of jam making and bottling in the kitchen. John returned to the markets at Reading to look at Jersey cattle again, while I spent an entire day ironing. Joan and Les came round one evening for supper, and so the month drew slowly to its close. The weather remained hot and heavy. Jennifer and Janet went to the circus in Southampton, while John attended football practice at the Dell. A thunderstorm rolled across the countryside that evening, though it brought very little rain. Summer was beginning to soften now, and so August slipped quietly away. A month that began with the last of the harvest carried us to the seaside for laughter and sunshine, and returned us home again to jam making, summer storms, and the slow turning of the farming year. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you again next Sunday when we go into September 1949, the next episode of My Mother's Diaries.